And what it means to know a phrase is to know the names associated to the parts of the phrase, to know the requirements that need to be satisfied in order for that phrase to exist, and third, to know the extra meaning that's achieved when those requirements are satisfied. Like I gave the example of Zayd's book. So over there we have one word kitab, we have the other word Zayd, but then the meanings are more. There's ownership and possession. If they ask you where did that come from, the correct answer is it came from the structure. So if you can say that confidently about every one of those 16, that means you know all 16 phrases. Welcome everyone to the fourth episode in the Arabic Accelerator Series, where we go through sentences from the stories of the Prophet's book and we parse them. And we try to be selective with the sentences we're choosing. Inshallah, we're going to get to work. We're going to get to work very quickly. But before that, let me explain a couple of things. Sentence parsing presupposes that the student has a level of grammar. Like you have to know the very basics of the two kinds of sentences, the nominal sentence and the verbal sentence, and you have to know what are the parts of the nominal sentence called and what are the parts of the verbal sentence called. And these things are explained in about 3 hours of training that I put together for free, and a couple of thousand people have already requested it and gone through it and they're watching it. You can look under the video in the description, follow the link and do the workshop. Okay, it's highly recommended. It's absolutely free. You just go there and you'll have a bird's eye view of how the language works. So in the opening days of class, what we do is we teach the most broadly applicable aspects of the language, and we introduce the student to the core issues. There's actually one video in the workshop, it's called the two core issues. And it talks about the jumla اسمية and the jumla fi'liyة, and it talks about how the entire Arabic language can be reduced down to just two issues that need to be resolved. And the solution to those two issues can be summarized in a single sentence. Okay, and then I have a 1 hour presentation that develops it and explains it and talks about the problem and the solution. So what it does is it gives the student laser focus, that everything they're studying will either be a solution to problem A or will be a solution to problem B. And if it's not a solution to those two problems, then it's not a very productive use of time. So you can quickly judge whether you're spending your time on the most productive things or not. Okay, so what are the two problems? One problem is that it occurs in nominal sentences. That if you have a sentence that doesn't have a verb at the front, but instead it begins with an ism, and the sentence is long, then that sentence needs to be segmented, and some of it would need to become the mubtada, and some of it would need to become the khabar. In English, this is a non-issue. In English, this issue doesn't exist. The reason is because they have a verb to be, is. And they say, for example, this masjid, which Ishaq alayhi salatu wasalam built in Sham, is Baytul Maqdis. So that's like 11 words. And from those 11 words, all of the words that are before the word is automatically the subject, and what comes after the word is the predicate, and the word is differentiates, and it distinguishes between the two halves of the sentence. Arabic doesn't have an is. So this is the first problem. It's called the lack of is issue. There's no is. There's a lack of is issue. So we need some way to be able to determine from where to where is the mubtada, where to where is the khabar, and this becomes especially important when the sentence becomes long. So how do we do it? Okay, so there's a solution for that, and the solution can be summarized in a single sentence, and I'll give you that in a minute. Let me talk about the second issue. The second issue occurs in verbal sentences. So when the sentence begins with a verb, which is unusual because in English, sentences don't begin with verbs. They begin with nouns. So regardless of the kind of predicate, in English, all sentences begin with the noun. So let me give you a few examples. Zayd is a human. Zayd is tall. Zayd is in the house. Zayd went. Zayd hit Amr. So you see all five examples. What's common between all five examples is Zayd is at the front. Now, if I was to render those five examples into Arabic, in 3 of them, Zayd would be at the front. But in 2 of them, the verb would be at the front. So whenever you choose to use a verb, because you don't have to, but whenever you choose to use the verb, the format changes and the subject of the sentence gets pushed forward and the verb then comes at the beginning. So it's like this. Those 5 examples, the 5 that I just listed to you, in Arabic would be like this. Zaydun insanun. Zaydun tawilun. Zaydun fil bayti. Dhahaba Zaydun. Daraba Zaydun amran. So those last 2 examples, dhahaba came at the front, and in the final example, daraba came at the front, and Zayd was pushed forward. So what this does is the grammar people, they noticed this and they said that this is so significant. So let's go ahead and let's classify the sentence based on the first word. So if the sentence begins with the verb, then we're going to call it a jumla fi'liya. And if it begins with the noun, then that's called a jumla ismiya. Okay? And the components of the jumla ismiya are called mubtada and khabar, and the components of the verbal sentence are called fi'l and fa'il. And fi'l and fa'il can have additional details depending on the meaning of the verb and depending on the amount of details that the speaker chooses to disclose. And they all have names, and it's isms that would answer those questions, like the what, the where, the when, the why, the how. So an ism would be used, and multiple isms, and sometimes prepositions will be brought in order to further give details about the action. Like if it's to travel, then you might want to communicate the origin, the place from where the travel, the departure occurred, and the place where the arrival is happening, the destination. So prepositions are sometimes used in order to introduce details of the verb, and sometimes there's no preposition. At any rate, fundamentally there's these two kinds of sentences. One of them is called the jumla ismiya, and the components of that are mubtada and khabar, and the other sentence is a jumla fi'liya, and the components of that are fi'l, fa'il, and maf'ul bihi. Okay, so what are the two issues? So I told you that in the nominal sentence, the issue is a lack of is issue. So if you have a 10-word long or 11-word long nominal sentence, then some of those words need to connect and form the first half of the sentence, and some of them need to connect and form the second half. In English, this is a non-issue because in English they have a verb that does exactly that. It separates between the two halves of the sentence, the subject and the predicate, and that is the verb is, is. Arabic doesn't have is. So how do we do it? Okay, so again, hold that thought. In the verbal sentence, when you have a verb, the verb is at the front, and then the multiple isms would be following it. And one of those isms would be the one doing the verb, and one of those isms is the one upon whom the verb is being done. And then you'd have further details, and those will all be isms that are communicating those details. So sequence does not determine grammar. In Arabic, sequence does not determine grammar. So in the absence of sequence determining grammar, how do we differentiate between the roles? So we said there's two problems. In the nominal sentence, the problem is lack of is, and in the verbal sentence, the problem is a completely different problem. The problem is how to differentiate between the roles of the isms. So we have a process that's likened to human emotions and facial expressions that can be taught in about 20 minutes. And through that, we assess and we study all the possible ways an ism could be used. And then we have these three categories. One of them is called rafa, the other one's called nasab, and the third one's called jar. And if you need to associate them, you can take rafa and line it up with he, nasab, line it up with him, and jar, line it up with his. Because in English, pronouns have three variations mostly, depending on how the pronoun is intended to be used. When the pronoun is intended to be the subject of a verb, you say he arrived. And when the pronoun is intended to be object of the verb, you say I saw him. And when the pronoun is intended to be part of a possessive structure, you say his pen. In English, that only happens in pronouns. It doesn't happen in nouns. There's no three versions of nouns. But in Arabic, it happens in the majority of isms. So the isms would actually change in order to differentiate between the roles. So understanding this process, which process? The process that's likened to human emotions and facial expressions, is half of grammar. And now that I've touched on the human emotions thing, let me just complete that thought. Okay, now if you visited the workshop and if you've gone through the 3 hours of training that I've recommended that people go through, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But for the benefit of the newer viewers, I can go through it very quickly. Basically, human beings experience emotional states. People make us happy, angry, sad, frustrated, irritable, and then these emotions are then reflected on our face. So when you look at the human being's face, you can tell what emotional state they're experiencing. So when you see the smile, you know it's happiness. When you see the other expression, you know it's the person's sad or he's depressed. And this happens because of interaction with other humans. Interaction with other humans. Arabic words behave in a similar fashion. Words influence words, and unlike human emotions that are endless, grammatical states in Arabic are just 4, and from the 4 is 3 that the ism experiences, and those 3 have names. One of them is called rafa, the other one's called nasab, and the third one's called jar. And then we have examples, like we use the pronoun analogy to further explain this he, him, and his, and it's a process. It's a process. The ism could be used in 22 different ways, but the states are just 3. So how do you take the 22 and how do you take the 3? How do you understand that? So it's all taught in the workshop, the 3 hours of training. So the assumption is that you've gone through it, or maybe you've studied these things elsewhere. At any rate, let me continue. So the two problems in the Arabic language, number 1, lack of is. The solution to that problem, which I never gave you earlier, but I'm giving it to you now. The solution to the lack of is problem is to know the phrase level relationships. So words can connect together to create phrases that function as a single unit. So instead of one word becoming the subject or the object or coming after a preposition, you have two words together doing all of those things. You have three words together doing all of those things. So if you know the phrase level relationships such as like mudaf and mudaf ilayh, kitabu zaydin, so there's a requirement that in the case of the mudaf, it has to be empty of al and there can't be any tanween. And the second word would be in the state of jar. So it would normally end in kasra. So kitabu zaydin. So the first word can fluctuate, kitabu, kitaba, kitabi, but zaydin will always be zaydin. So these three requirements, two requirements for the mudaf and one requirement for the mudaf ilayh, can only happen here. It can't happen anywhere else in the language. So when you're going from right to left and you're looking at word A and comparing it with word B and looking to see if any requirements are being satisfied, then you'd be paying attention to this. That is there al, is there no al, is there tanween, is there no tanween, and the next word is a matching, is it in jar? So these things all play a role. So basically there's 16 phrases in the Arabic language, there's 16 ways that words could be connected together that are all less than a sentence. So what is a phrase? A phrase is two or more words connected together in some sort of relationship that's not a sentence, and it functions as a single unit. So that can happen in about 16 ways. There's two that are extremely popular, the mudaf mudaf ilayh and the mawsuf sifa, and then there's others that are still worth knowing, like the ismul ishara and the mushanu ilayh, and the prepositional phrase, which is a kind of phrase that's made up of a preposition, which we call a harf jar or a jar, and we have a majroor, the object of a preposition. So those two together connect and they become a muta'alliq. And then there's other phrases, like 6 or 7 very common phrases. So through these parsing videos, this Arabic Accelerator Series, what I'm doing is I'm reinforcing the grammar that was taught in the workshop, and I'm also introducing new elements based on need and necessity. So in the previous presentation, and I'll flash the link above, we talked about an and anna. So what is the function of an and what is the function of anna? So what they do is they take what would have otherwise been a full sentence and they water it down and they convert it and they reduce it to either the infinitive, the masdar, or they reduce it to a fact, which then allows you to take that elaborate structure and use it in place of a noun, where a noun would be used. A full sentence cannot always be used in a place of a noun, so it needs to be, sometimes it's too large, so sometimes it needs to be reduced and watered down. So we talked about this in the previous video, an and anna. And the one before that, we talked about the mawsul, the relative pronoun, and why we have it, and what's the benefit of it, and what's the origin story. Like, why was it coined in the Arabic language? What's its primary feature and function? So this is the point behind all of these videos. Inshallah, we're going to do a deep dive on one topic and while analyzing a sentence. So today's sentence is the masjid example. So the lack of it is the issue. How is it solved? It's solved by knowing the phrase level relationships. So you go from right to left and you take two words at a time and you see which relationships exist. And at some point, you're going to notice that all of the phrase level relationships are exhausting and there's nothing further. So at that point, you stop the mubtada and that's where the predicate begins. So the sentence is the masjid example. So we're going to analyze this fully today for the first time. I've referenced it like in almost every video from the beginning of this series, but today we're going to dive deep on it and we're going to do the entire sentence. So here's the sentence. وَهَذَا الْمَسْجِدُ الَّذِي بَنَاهُ إِسْحَاقُ فِي الشَّامِ بَيْتُ الْمَقْدِسِ. And this masjid, which Ishaq alayhi salatu wasalam built in Sham, is Baytul Maqdis. So if you ignore the waw at the front and you count from hadha until the end, how many words would it be? I'll give you like a few seconds and maybe you want to pause this video and try to do that count and then resume the video. If you said 10, and I mentioned 10 a few times already, but if you counted and you arrived at 10, you would be correct. And they are number 1, hadha, number 2, al-masjidu, number 3, alladhi, and then we have bana, which would be the 4th word, and then the hu, which is attached to bana, would be the 5th word. And then ishaqu would be word number 6. Ishaqu would be word number 6. Fi shami would be 7, 8, and Baytul Maqdis would be 9 and 10. Okay, so that's the step number 1, to count the number of words. So we did it, and the number's 10. And the only mistake that could have occurred there is if somebody counted banahu as 3. Banahu, or counted it as 1. If you counted banahu as 1, that would be an error. And if you counted banahu as 3, that would be an error. The correct is banahu is 2 words. The reason it could have conceivably been counted as 3 is if Ishaq wasn't there. It would be like this. And this masjid which he built in Sham is Baytul Maqdis. This masjid which he, hypothetical person, built in Sham is Baytul Maqdis. then in that example, banahu would be counted as 3, and the total number would still be 10. Okay, except here we have the word ishaq sitting there, so therefore the verb is empty. Okay, and if you took banahu and counted it all as one word, that would be an error because you missed the pronoun. Attached pronouns, you have to be aware that whenever there's attached pronouns, they have to receive a separate count. So pretty straightforward. Total number of words are 10. What's the smaller number that the larger number needs to fit into? The answer is 2, mubtada and khabar, because it's a nominal sentence, and nominal sentence is always divided into 2 parts. What's the division? Okay, so the division is 8 and 2. So how do we know it's 8 and 2? So at this stage right now, you would hypothesize that it's 8 and 2, and then you'd proceed to step number 3, and then while doing step number 3, it will either confirm your initial hypothesis that it's 8 and 2, or you'll realize your error. And that's the benefit of doing this. Okay, so when you go into parsing a sentence, normally you would go in with 70-80% taken care of already. Some people might have this in their minds that this seems redundant. Like, I mean, these things are either obvious. Like, I mean, what's the point? The point is that you don't go in there knowing nothing. You go in there with 90% understanding of what it is. So the process then takes you from 90 to 100. So when you do it, it takes you from 90 to 100. And when you get good at it, then this process becomes subconscious. And you don't have to actually count the number of words and smaller number that the larger number needs to fit into. Those steps, they're for beginners. So we're doing this in order to reinforce the grammar that we taught earlier. And we're doing this as an excuse to teach new grammar and tell you the function of an and anna and tell you why we have alladhi and what it does and why it's needed, etc., etc. So now we're going to take the lengthy mubtada and we're going to parse it. So this mubtada, which is 8 words, so we change the color of the marker. This 8 words, it divides into 2 parts. So the hadha would be on the side on its own, and al-masjidul ladhi until the end would be the second half, and they are labeled ismul ishara and musharu ilayh. Okay, now ismul ishara and musharu ilayh is one of the common phrases. So if there were like 7 phrases that are very common, this would be one of them. Absolutely, it would be one of them. So the first part of this phrase is called ismul ishara, and the second part of this phrase is called musharu ilayh. Just like in the descriptive noun adjective one, the first part's called mawsuf, and the second part's called sifa. Mawsuf, sifa. And in the possessive one, the first part's called mudaf, and the second part's called mudaf ilayh. So for every phrase, essentially what you need to know is 2 pieces of information. And there's 16 of them, and the common ones are 6 or 7. So for every phrase, you just need to know 2 pieces of information, actually 3 pieces of information. First of all, what are the technical terms associated to each part of the phrase? So the mawsuf sifa, the noun adjective one, mawsuf and sifa. The possessive one, mudaf mudaf ilayh. This demonstrative one, the first part will be called ismul ishara, the second part will be called musharu ilayh. So knowing the technical terms is useful. The second piece of information you would want to know about every phrase is what's the new meaning it communicates. Because in the Arabic language, the majority of meanings don't come from words, they come from vowels and patterns and grammatical structures. So by grammatical structures, we're intending these phrases. So when you have 2 nouns lined up side by side, and the first noun is empty of al and tanween, and the second noun is in jar, and they're arranged in that particular way, with those particular requirements satisfied, then you get more than what you started off with. So when you say Kitabu Zaydin, the translation is Zayd's book, and that's not 2 meanings. We have the meaning of book, we have the meaning of Zayd, which is the name of an individual, and we have a third meaning, which is ownership and possession. So if they ask you where did the ownership and possession come from, the correct answer is it came from the structure. It came from the satisfying of those requirements. Okay, so what's the terminology associated to the parts of a particular phrase? Number 2, what are the requirements that need to be satisfied in order for that phrase to exist? And number 3, what is the additional meaning that's achieved when those requirements are satisfied? So you got those 3 things, you are a master of that phrase. Okay, so you just need to know those 3 things about any phrase. So if there's 16 phrases, you would need to know, you would need to be able to recreate that for every one of those 16. The mudaf mudaf ilayh, the mawsuf sifa, which we taught in the workshop, and the ismul ishara musharu ilayh, which is coming here, and then other phrases. They will be introduced to you as they're occurring within the book. So in the case of the ismul ishara, the scholars, they tell us that it could be used on its own, and it could be used in conjunction with a noun where it and the noun together are functioning as a single unit. And what determines whether it's being used on its own or whether it's being used as part of a phrase, is the upcoming noun having al. So when the upcoming noun has al, then the two are a phrase. And if the upcoming noun doesn't have al, which would mean it would have tanween, هذا مسجد, then the alladhi would go away. We wouldn't need the alladhi anymore, and the translation would change. It would be هذا مسجد بناه إسحاق في الشام, and then the sentence would end there. And Baytul Maqdis, you'd have to do something else with that. Okay, you'd have to create a new sentence in order to incorporate Baytul Maqdis. The translation would be, this is a masjid which Ishaq alayhi salam built in Sham, and it just so happens that this masjid is Baytul Maqdis. So you're gonna have to use too many words there, right? So to be more efficient, what the author did here is it says هذا المسجد. He created a lengthy mubtada, so then he doesn't have to use two sentences. You see? Okay, so those two are definitely connecting together as a phrase. So what that means is that the predicate can't start. The predicate, the second half of the sentence, can't start, and it would be incorrect to drop the is between those two. Now what's happening between al-masjid and alladhi? So in the previous video, the previous one, we talked about alladhi and allati and the mawsul. It's called ism mawsul, relative pronoun in English. And relative pronouns in English are deployed whenever you have a noun that's being described using a full sentence, keeping all of it a phrase. So if you want to describe a noun using a sentence, and then you could say something like, an Azar would sell idols. An Azar would sell idols. So I'm talking about Azar, and I'm saying something about Azar that he used to sell idols. So over there, it's not a who, what, which environment, because that's a full sentence. But if I want to keep it a phrase, like Azar, who used to sell idols, was Ibrahim alayhi salam's father, something along those lines, then alladhi and allati would be deployed. In English, they use a relative pronoun whenever a noun needs to be described using a sentence, and all of it together is functioning as a single unit. In order to keep it a phrase, who, what, which would be brought in between. In Arabic, it only happens 50% of the time. It depends on the noun, whether it's definite or indefinite. If the noun is indefinite, then there's no need for alladhi, the who, what, which would be automatic. And we saw that in the sentence in the second episode, where it said وَسَكَتَتِ الْأَصْنَامُ, and the sentence was وَسَكَتَتِ الْأَصْنَامُ لِأَنَّهَا حِجَارَةٌ لَا تَنْطِقُ, and the idols remained quiet because they were rock that does not speak. So the word rock and the does not speak is does not speak is a full sentence, and it's describing rock, and all of it together is a phrase. So in English, the which would be brought. In Arabic, the allati would not be brought, because hijaratun is indefinite. And over here, al-masjid happens to be definite. So basically, al-masjid would be mawsuf, and alladhi onwards would be the sifa, and that would be how we break down the musharun ilayh. So until this sifa is complete, the predicate cannot start. Okay, you see, the solution to the lack of is issue is to go from right to left and look at the words, taking two at a time, and seeing the phrase level relationships. Wherever all of the phrase level relationships exhaust, that's where the predicate begins. You see? So alladhi is the ism mawsul, and every ism mawsul has to be followed by a sentence. And this sentence is called sila, mawsul and sila. And this sentence could be a nominal sentence, and it could be a verbal sentence. So until that sentence is complete, the predicate cannot start. Until that sentence is complete. So in this case, after alladhi, we have banahu ishaqu. Bana is a verb. So it's a verbal sentence. And verbal sentences have their own components. Bare minimum would be two. Okay, and depending on the meaning, it's very likely that it could have three parts. And if there's a prepositional phrase, then we can count that as a part. So if you look from banahu ishaqu fi Sham, all of that together is 1, 2, 3, 4 major portions. Fi Sham being the fourth one. And Fi Sham is clearly the building happened in Sham. The building of the masjid happened where? It happened in Sham. So the Fi Sham is connecting to Bana. So all of that together is part of the phrase that was started with the alladhi, which is part of the phrase that started with al-masjid, which is part of the phrase that started with hada. So we have a phrase within a phrase within a phrase. How about that? So we changed the color of the marker 3 times in order to go down 3 layers to capture all of this. So from the beginning, the sentence divides into mubtada and khabar, 8 and 2. The 8 words divide into a ismul ishara, which is hada on its own, and the musharu ilay, which is all of the rest of the words until Sham. And then the musharu ilay divides into mawsuf and sifa. Al-masjid would be mawsuf, and alladhi banahu ishaqu fi Sham would be sifa. the sifa divides into mawsul and sila. Mawsul with a L, with a lam, and sila. Mawsul means relative pronoun, and sila means the relative clause, which is a sentence. Now within the sila is a sentence, so we change the color of the marker and we start all over again, because remember, once we've determined the smaller number that the larger number needs to fit into, then we proceed to divide them, and then we keep repeating steps 2 and 3 until every word is accounted for. So we start all over with bana. So this time the sentence is verbal. So fi'al maf'ul bihi fa'il. Okay, instead of fi'al fa'il maf'ul bihi, fi'al maf'ul bihi, the who is the maf'ul bihi, and ishaq was the fa'il, and fi sham is called muta'alliq. Muta'alliq further divides into jar majrur. The mubtada is done, and Baytul Maqdis would be the khabar. Now we move on to the khabar side and we say mudaf ilayh, and now every word is accounted for. And that concludes the parsing of this sentence. And in this video, I explained to you the 2 core issues that are there in the Arabic language. The first issue is lack of is, and the solution to the lack of is issue is to know the phrase level relationships. If you know that, that's half of grammar. If you know all 16 of them, you literally know half of grammar. If you know 6 or 7 more popular ones, you know 85% of grammar, because those 6 or 7 account for the vast majority of phrases that you'll ever encounter, right? So by about the 7th week or the 8th week, the students will know them. They'll know the majority. By about week 12, they'll know like 12 of them. So for the sake of completion, I'll give them the other 4, and I'll create a video and say, here's all 16 in one place. All 16 phrases. That's half of grammar if you know them. And what it means to know a phrase is to know the names associated to the parts of the phrase, to know the requirements that need to be satisfied in order for that phrase to exist, and third, to know the extra meaning that's achieved when those requirements are satisfied. Like I gave the example of Zayd's book. So over there we have one word kitab, we have the other word Zayd, but then the meanings are more. There's ownership and possession. If they ask you where did that come from, the correct answer is it came from the structure. So if you can say that confidently about every one of those 16, that means you know all 16 phrases. Done. Okay, and the issue in the verbal sentence is that sequence doesn't determine grammar, so we need some method to be able to differentiate between the roles of the isms. If you understand that method, and by method I mean the process that's likened to human emotions and facial expressions, then that's the other half of grammar. And you know that, you know pretty much all of grammar. And then there's certain details that are specialization level details, and you can pick them up slowly. Because once you've studied all of this through this 80-20 approach, then at some point you're going to want to read an actual manual in Nahu, in grammar, and do it from cover to cover. So in our program, in the 6th month of the program, we start a book called Hidayat al-Nahu. It's the best book in the world for grammar. I've taught it 42 times. And that book, while we're doing that book, we're not doing anything else. So the stories of the prophets, 2 of them, this little green book, and there's another one which is about the same size, and that covers the stories of Nuh, Salih, and Hud, alayhimus salatu wassalam. And this one covers the stories of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Yusuf alayhi salam. So both of these books are taught in the first 6 months, and we translate them. We give the students all of the vocabulary. So by the end, they will know every word that's in these 2 books. Not only will they know them, they will know them intimately. And I asked ChatGPT the other day, and I said that on the internet there's these lists, high frequency lists of the words that occur in the Quran. There's a 50% list and there's an 85% list. So if I fed to you the 2 Qasas books, the Stories of the Prophets 1 and the Story of the Prophets 2, and you were to map that onto the frequency list, can you tell me if those lists are swallowed up by the Qasas book? So it did the analysis, and it said that the smaller list I can say with 100% confidence that is completely and utterly swallowed up. There's not a single word in the 50% list that doesn't occur in the Qasas books repeatedly. So in other words, if anything, it maintains the same frequency that is maintained in the Quran. That these words, and they're normally function words, like an and anna. But the frequency list won't tell you the feature and function of an. And it won't tell you the feature and function of anna like I did in the previous video. It will just tell you that anna means that, and anna means that, the fact that, and an means to, T-O, like as in to prostrate. So prostrating becomes to prostrate. So that's all they'll tell you. I mean, you can go check what it says about an and anna, and I would be surprised if it gave you more detail than what I just mentioned. Okay, so, and then the 85% list, it said, I don't have that list, it's about 600 words. The 85% list is about 600 words, and it accounts for 85% of the words that are used in the entire Quran. So how much of that is included within the first and the second qasas. ChatGPT, it said that a very high percentage of the second list would also be quote unquote swallowed by the qasas book, maybe up to 90%. And maybe certain words like Lut alayhi salam, because Lut alayhi salam's story is not in here. So certain prophets that aren't referenced in the qasas book, they might not be in here. Sulaiman might not be in here. Dawood might not be in here because their stories are coming in the fourth and the fifth qasas books. Okay, maybe you might not find Fir'aun might not be here. Fir'aun is in the 600 list, 600 word list, but it's not in the qasas book because the story of Fir'aun's not here. You see that? The word qisas might not be in here. And yameen and swearing an oath and some of these fiqh terms that occur in the Quran quite frequently, like divorce issues, marriage issues, and so those things might not be in the qasas book. But apart from that, 90% of the high frequency words will be here. So people ask the question that if I study with your method, then is it reasonable to assume that within a year I'll be able to understand the majority of the Quran? What I would say, gotta be a little careful here, because Arabic is the first thing that the scholars study and they continue studying it for the rest of their lives. I'll say that again. Arabic is the first thing that the scholars study and they continue studying it for the rest of their lives. So I mean, this is not a joke, okay? So we don't want to give anyone any false hopes. But if you're going to believe that the 85% vocabulary list can give you 85% understanding of the entire Quran, that's completely false. Okay, that's disproven, that's refuted. Because the majority of meanings in Arabic, they don't even come from words. So you can memorize that list and you can read it in your sleep and you still won't be able to understand 85% of the Quran. You need to know the things we're studying here, the grammar. So if you go through these two qasas books and you study the amount of grammar we teach in the first 6 months, and you know the sarf, and you know all of the verb patterns and the active and the passive and the irregularities, and where verbs are deficient and they lose their letters, you're able to trace them back to their original. Because without that knowledge, you can't look up the word in the dictionary either. So if you know these things, then you could understand a large portion of surface level translation of the Quran. You see, but you're still gonna have to study tafsir. And I mean, like, I don't want to make any promises of that nature, but it gives you an idea. And all of this will then prepare you to read without vowels. Okay, so this is all important, and this is why in the 6th month of the program, when we start our Hidayatul Nahu book, that book is unvoweled. So in the first 20 pages of that book, I teach the students how to efficiently and properly read without vowels. And it's got nothing to do with vocabulary. Like, vocabulary doesn't help you at all. Okay, because the grammar books are quote unquote zero vocabulary books. There's no vocabulary in those books. I mean, mubtada, khabar, these are the words that you'll see occurring in a grammar book. So if you're having trouble reading the book, it's not because of a lack of vocabulary, it's because of a lack of knowing how the language works. Okay, so I think that's enough for this session, and we'll continue with the playlist and we'll try to get it to 10 videos. And the video that you'll see here would be the next one in the playlist. Okay, and if it's not there, then that means I haven't created it. In the meantime, it might be a good idea to watch the very first video where I talked about the 80-20 principle and how when you apply it to the Arabic language, then you could bring out from the language a 4%, that if you know that, it gives you half of all of your benefits. And this is what makes it possible to study Arabic 17 times faster. Okay, so I'll link to that and you can go ahead and watch that. I look forward to speaking with you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.